Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Trade Justice Alliance National TPP call. Tonight, our topic is going to be TPP's threat to communities of color. And our very special guest is going to be Bill Spriggs, the chief economist from the AFL-CIO. Everybody who has joined us on these calls before, they know that we do not use the audio in the meeting room. We use phone audio from our conference call so that we get a clean, clear recording. So please, if you haven't already done so, join us on the phone. It's area code 605-562-3140, and the PIN number is 951146. As I said, we're going to be joined by Bill Spriggs of the AFL-CIO. Bill is chair of the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He is also a board member of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Guillermo Perez joins us. He is a board member for the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement. He is a labor educator with the Education and Membership Department of the United Steelworkers. That's my dad's old union. We're also going to be joined by our wonderful activist, Dr. Margaret Flowers, co-director of Popular Resistance and co-organizer of Flush the TPP, along with Adam Weissman, Global Justice for Animals and the Environment, and Trade Justice New York. I'm Andrea Miller. I'm the Executive Director of People Demanding Action, and again, I want to welcome you. I'm going to very briefly go over our call structure and our norms. As I mentioned earlier, the audio is phone only. We also ask that people do not turn on their video cameras. This allows us to have people who have low or slow internet connections to join us in the meeting room and see the PowerPoint presentation. All of our calls are recorded, and a link will be made available after the call for the call recording. We also post the PowerPoint online with the call recording, and a few hours after the call, a YouTube version of the call will be available. Currently, we have everyone in Q&A mode. This eliminates background noise, and it mutes everyone with the exception of speakers while we are recording. When we are doing a Q&A with our guests, we will invite you to press *6 so that you will be able to be entered into the queue, and then I will call on you and you'll be able to get your questions asked. When you ask a question, we want people to say your name, and if you're with an organization, give your organization, and also what city you're in. And we also ask that people be courteous and brief so that other people have a chance to ask questions too. We're also going to ask, because I see there's a lot of activity going on in the chat room, that you keep your chat discussions on topic. As I said before, audio is phone only. There is a chat function on the left side of the screen, and people are availing themselves of that. There is a share button at the bottom right of the screen down below the member list. You can use the share button to download a copy of this PowerPoint that I am showing in the meeting room. Now, you also can download the PowerPoint, and this is where you will get a link to the call recording from the peopledemandingaction.org website. In our downloads folder under TPP, and then the TPP March 6, 2016 call materials. You can use that download folder and download information from many of our past calls, all of our calls from 2016, as well as calls going back to August 24th, 2015. Those are all still on our website in the download section. Now I want to introduce the people who make these calls possible. Our technical advisor and Facebook page manager is Tom Hopkins. Tom is with Move On in Pennsylvania. Tom will answer any pre- and post-call technical questions. Tom also is the manager of our Facebook page, and that Facebook page is facebook.com/group/global TPP team. Also on the call with us tonight, and one of our chat hosts is Lisa Oldendorf. Lisa is with Move On New York. So not only is she one of our chat hosts, she is also a member of the call planning team. Now, also on the call but driving is Harriet Haywood, another member of our call planning team. She is the call co-organizer, and she is the Florida State Leader for People Demanding Action. Celeste Drake of the AFL-CIO is another member of our call planning team. Celeste is with the trade. Celeste is the Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist for the AFL-CIO. Linda Brewster is joining us tonight as well. She is a member of our call planning team. She is with Move On in Washington State. And then Mara Cohen also is with us tonight. Mara works with me on the PDA mass criminalization team. She is a popular resistance organizer, and she also is part of the Global Climate Convergence in Illinois. Emily Ann Sladen will not be able to be with us tonight. Emily Ann is sick, but for those of you who have been on the calls, you know that every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, Emily Ann leads us in a Twitter storm. The Twitter storm consists of anywhere from 20 to about 30 tweets, and we all tweet out at the same time. Now, all you need to know in order to be part of our Twitter storm is you need to be able to log into your Twitter account. You need to know where we keep the tweets, and they are at tiny.cc/TPP Media March, and then you need to know how to copy and paste. This week's meme that we will be sharing is right here on the screen for us. So stop TPP, and then a little child, and on its hands are written the words, "Rise Up." I'm going to introduce our first speaker, our first guest tonight, Mr. Guillermo Perez. Guillermo is a board member for the Labor Council for Latin America Advancement, and he's the labor educator with the United Steelworkers. Before joining the United Steelworkers as a labor educator, and he's been there since January 2011. Guillermo worked as a labor education specialist with the Civil Service Employees Union, AFSCME, Local 1000, out of Albany, New York. He has worked as a trainer recruiter with the AFL-CIO Organization Institute and an organizer with the Service Employees International Union at CIU. Guillermo holds a law degree from the Illinois Institute of Technology, a master's in communication from the University of Michigan, and a bachelor's in English literature from the University of Chicago. So, Guillermo, welcome. I'm going to bring up your first slide, and you just tell me when you want me to go to another slide.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me on tonight. Again, I'm here representing both the United Steelworkers, the largest manufacturing union in North America, as well as the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, which is sort of the Latino caucus of the AFL-CIO. I sit on the national board of LACLA for the United Steelworkers, and I am also the president of our local chapter of LACLA here in Pittsburgh. And I was invited to come on and talk about the impact of TPP on the Latino community. And I can just say from the outset that my comments are going to start off with sort of focusing on sort of two different segments of the Latino community. The one being Latinos who have lived here in the United States for a generation or several generations, and then the millions of Latino working people who are here as part of a massive wave of immigration that's happened from Latin America over the last 30 years or so. And many of these people are unauthorized immigrants, undocumented people and workers. And so I want to talk about sort of what's the impact on both of these groups, with a special emphasis on the unauthorized immigrants, and that's a major focus of my work as an activist in LACLA. So starting with the first slide, we sort of start off with this statement: our trade policy has been horrific for working people in the United States and workers in the countries that are parties to these agreements, as evidenced by NAFTA and CAFTA. I think that for the overwhelming majority of people on this call, it's fairly obvious that neither NAFTA or CAFTA has brought about all the many benefits that we were told that were to come from expanded trade. And, you know, just now since Thursday of last week, we have sort of another prime example of what CAFTA has failed to do for Honduras, with the murder now recently of Berta Caceras, a leading environmentalist in Honduras, a leader, a mother of four, who had led opposition to a development project, a dam, that was impacting people in her community. She had, in fact, held a press conference a week earlier to call attention to the killing of four fellow activists, and now on Thursday she herself was murdered. This, of course, in Honduras is not that odd, given it's got one of the highest murder rates in the world. It's among the top five. It just recently got edged out by El Salvador, another CAFTA country. So Berta's murder and the murder of countless other people who have been active either on environmental issues. Now we have one environmental group that's calling Honduras the most dangerous place in the world for environmentalists. Guatemala has now surpassed Colombia as the most dangerous place for trade unionists. And of course, everybody's aware of the flood of refugees coming from the Golden Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. It's a crisis of huge proportions, and clear evidence for those of us who follow these things that the whole policy of trade, the relationship, our relationship with Central America, has not brought about economic benefits for the people in Central America. And it's contributed to both the push and the pull that's led to these huge numbers of unauthorized immigrants. So I traveled to Honduras in 2014 as part of a group from the AFL that went there. I had never been there before. My family, I'm Cuban American. And I just wanted to read, if I could, what I submitted, if I can find it, what I submitted in my report coming out of that trip. And of course, here it is. These are the conclusions that I wrote to the Leo Gerard, the president of the United Steelworkers, on that particular visit. As union representatives, community activists, and progressive political leaders made clear to us, these are the people we visited in Honduras, and all of which was reinforced, albeit unintentionally, by the U.S. ambassador and the Honduran Ministry of Labor, both of whom we visited. After nearly 10 years of CAFTA, Honduras is an unmitigated disaster. In other words, a failed state, un estado fallido in Spanish. Wage and hour violations are the norm. The Labor Ministry did not challenge our estimate that 70% of the country's workforce is paid below the legal minimum wage, including the heavily subsidized jobs in the maquila zone. So the government subsidized jobs of international corporations in the maquila zones, and these subsidized jobs don't even pay the minimum wage in Honduras. Rights to association and to organize are routinely violated, and labor community activists, as well as journalists and human rights activists, have been harassed and murdered. Honduras is now the leader in most unequal distribution of income in Latin America and has the highest murder per capita rate in the world. As I said, they've just now recently been surpassed by El Salvador. In addition to being one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere, the current government solutions are to militarize an overwhelmingly corrupt police with a Plan Colombia-style approach, heavily funded by the U.S., continued cuts in social spending, expanded subsidies to multinationals without regard to their rampant wage violations, enhancing job creation through the proliferation of part-time work, privatization of the public sector, and forced land appropriation for the purpose of pursuing monocultural agriculture in the form of African palm cultivation to the exclusion of almost every other crop, resulting in the near total destruction of subsistence farming. This is neoliberalism on steroids and has created a national economy that would almost certainly collapse if it were not for the remittances, by far and away some of the highest in Central America as a percentage of GDP. We're talking about 17% of the GDP of Honduras. That's the portion of their GDP that comes by way of remittances. And those are many, many unauthorized Hondureños in the United States who are sending money back to support their family. In other words, Honduras' central failure at creating widespread life-sustaining employment has led directly to its most productive export, undocumented laborers to the U.S. We have in Honduras a vivid and tragic illustration of how so-called free trade agreements like CAFTA and now TPP fail working people of all the countries involved, invariably result in forced migration and displacement of those most deeply impacted. So I think by any measure, CAFTA has been a horrific failure for the countries involved, and most especially the three countries now that are in crisis and have led many of their people to flee violence, crime, violence, and of course lack of economic opportunity. And of course the case is no different in Mexico with what's happened to NAFTA. Mexico had, from 1960 to 1980, its economy almost doubled. It's now one of the slowest growing economies in the world since NAFTA. So, and of course, at the time that NAFTA was passed, we were told that it was going to be part of a solution to unauthorized immigration because it was going to create all this economic opportunity for Mexicans. And in fact, it's not done that. The poverty rate in Mexico is over 50% now, or at least in 2012, as it was 20 years earlier when NAFTA came along. Let's go to the next slide. So we also have to talk about what TPP does in terms of, in the context of what these earlier trade agreements did. And in our opinion, it's again going to be a continuation and exacerbation of what have already been negative trends for the people of Latin America, and certainly for people in the United States. So it's worth mentioning that it's in essence going to extend this race to the bottom, put workers in poor countries in Central America now in competition with even poorer workers, and again will only contribute to the pull and push that's leading so many of the working people in the Golden Triangle to flee for their lives and pursue something in the way of a better life in the United States. Let's go to the next slide. In the U.S., TPP will result in the further deterioration of our own manufacturing sector, a sector vital to a successful industrialized economy. The point I wanted to make with respect to the manufacturing sector is basically this. All of these trade agreements have led to huge losses of manufacturing jobs. Many people of color, African Americans and Latinos, have lost jobs because of this. But I think it's also important to point out that the concentration of women, people of color, in the service sector where there are largely low-paying jobs, that the impact of TP in these sectors is also going to be felt. Because what happens when you destroy manufacturing jobs, when you destroy them as a result of these unfair rules of trade that these trade agreements set up. For example, in the case of TPP, there'll be nothing to meaningfully address the currency manipulation that the TPP countries engage in. This has resulted in many, many millions of jobs lost in the United States. We've lost 4.8 million U.S. manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2015. So these are well-paying jobs. They actually create other jobs as well. When they're lost, the impact is profound. And what we end up with is an economy that's increasingly dominated by poorly paying service sector jobs. TPP will only make that situation worse. It will actually increase competition for these poorly paying jobs as more and more people get displaced and have to seek other forms of work. The bottom line is that TPP, like the earlier trade agreements, will create some jobs that will destroy many, many more jobs and result in net losses. And an increase in the trade deficit that in the long term is led to a shrinking middle class, greater economic inequality, and everything that negatively impacts working people has an even more adverse impact on communities of color. If we go to the next slide, TPP will contribute to further violence, poverty, and exploitation that's driving unauthorized immigration from Mexico and Central America to the U.S., as I had pointed out earlier. So the bottom line with this is that everybody loses except a handful of extremely wealthy people in this trade agreement. It's undercutting the long-term prospects, economic prospects for working people in the United States. It's creating failed states in countries like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and of course Mexico. It's creating divisions in our society as undocumented immigrants who are here, part of our community, should be given an opportunity for citizenship or at the very least legal status. They are continuing to be victimized, exploited, forced to live in the shadows, subject to detention and deportation. It's a tragedy on a huge scale, and these trade agreements only contribute to the tragedy. And as I said, hurt all workers, Latino, women, men, white, black, native-born, foreign-born, documented and undocumented. That's it for me.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Guillermo. And Guillermo, earlier in his discussion, talk about the murder. Do you want to go into a little more detail about that, because we do have the slide?
Well, I can't speak specifically to the particular movement that Berta Caceras was a part of. I can only speak generally. When we met with people involved on the ground with trying to organize workers, in, whether it be trying to organize workers into unions or trying to save communities that were threatened by development projects like the dam that she was organizing against. There's no rule of law there. In fact, when we confronted the U.S. Embassy in Honduras about the murder of people who are civically engaged, their response was, well, the murder rate here is sky high. There's lots of crime, violent crime. So who's to say that people get murdered for their activism versus getting murdered just because they were the victim of crime? So I wish I could add more to it. I don't know enough about her background and what her efforts were. But for Honduras, this is nothing unusual. It takes place in almost every segment of civil society.
And thank you very much for that, Guillermo. And I think everybody saw on the slide that the hydroelectric dam that they wanted to build would basically prevent ethnic or indigenous people from being able to access water, food, and medicine, which in many, many instances we've seen far too many times. This is what happens when we get all this building in other countries and there is no attention paid to the people currently living on the land. All right. I want to invite the folks on the phone to participate and ask any questions that you may have of Guillermo. In order to get on the queue, press *6 on your phone, and then I will see you in the queue, and I'll be able to open your line. Now, when I open your line, give us your name, your organization, if you have one, and your city. All right, first caller. I have a caller from, let me try that again. My computer is really slow. Ooh. All right, let's try this. Area code 316.
Hi, this is Shannon from Kansas. I was under the impression that with CAFTA, policies were put in place to help protect the workers down there, because every new trade agreement we hear how there's an improvement on labor and labor organizations. Am I incorrect in that? And if I'm not, has the United States done anything to help support these workers and the activists down there?
Well, I can tell you that they're part of the CAFTA agreement was supposed to require countries to, at the very least, comply with their own labor law. So, in the case of Honduras, they have a minimum wage law that's violated. Basically, 70% of workers in Honduras don't even earn the minimum wage. There are also supposed to be protections to organize and form unions. Those are regularly violated. The AFL-CIO has been involved in bringing one case in Guatemala, another case in Honduras, trying to use CAFTA as a way of trying to enforce something in the way of labor and human rights, and nothing comes of these cases. The best analogy I can make is in a union context, which is it's like having a grievance procedure that the boss can put off forever without ever having to take any serious action to address any of these violations. So CAFTA, is extremely weak in terms of enforcing any of these standards, and that's been the story of NAFTA, CAFTA, and the TPP is no different. So the answer to your question is no. The U.S. government has failed horribly in terms of enforcing the labor standards that were, in some cases, were improved in order to sort of sell the CAFTA agreement, but are routinely violated. I mean, it's, as I said, in my opinion, it's a failed state. A country that allows 70% of its workforce to earn sub-minimum wage, to me, is a failed state. And the U.S. is a party to that.
Are there any other questions for Guillermo? *6 if you want to ask a question. All right. Well, I've got another question. Caller, your line is open.
Hi, Guillermo. I spent some time as a human rights observer in Guatemala in the Ishkan during the return in the early 90s, and I'm aware that on occasion these murdered activists, the murder has stimulated whole new movements. And I'm thinking specifically of Mama Makin. And I wonder if you think that the murder of Berta Caceras will stimulate a similar response in Honduras.
Certainly I hope it does. I can tell you, having met, as I said, with some of the people on the ground organizing there in 2014. They're the bravest people I've ever met. But we have to keep in mind, these are countries that are experiencing huge amounts of displacement. Major segments of the population are leaving, fleeing, and their own government, certainly in the case of Honduras, is arguably a party to the crimes that are going on there. So I hope that's the case. When incredibly brave activists take on these kinds of corporate criminals or state criminals, for that matter, you would hope that people who display that kind of bravery will inspire a lot of other people, and I certainly hope it's the case. But it's extremely challenging under the circumstances, given the state of civil society in countries like Honduras and Guatemala. It's very, very tough for them to do this. So I don't know. I can't say. I hope so, and certainly we should show all the solidarity we can to Berta's family and to the activists in Honduras who are risking their lives to confront an abuse of power.
Guillermo, thank you so very much for that presentation.
Thanks for having me.
I am now going to, as Dr. Flowers, Margaret, are you on the call yet? I don't have Dr. Flowers, but Bill Spriggs is on the call, so I'm going to welcome William Spriggs. William Spriggs is a professor and former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University, and he served as chief economist at the AFL-CIO. In his role with the AFL-CIO, he chairs the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He also serves on the board of the National Bureau of Economic Research. From 2009 to 2012, Bill served as Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy at the Department of Labor, having been an Obama appointee, and he was confirmed by the U.S. Senate, something that they seem very, very reluctant to do, but I digress. Bill also served as chairman of the Healthcare Trust for United Auto Workers Retirees of the Ford Motor Company and vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Political Education and Leadership Institute. Some other of Bill's former positions include leading roles in economic policy development and research as a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, executive director for the Institute for Opportunity and Equality of the National Urban League, and as an economist for the Democratic staff of the Joint Economic Committee of Congress. He's former president of the National Economic Association, the Organization of America's Professional Black Economists. Bill graduated from Williams College in Massachusetts. He holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He also taught for 6 years at Norfolk State University and for 2 years at North Carolina A&T State University. Dr. Spriggs, welcome. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. My reception seems a little off. Am I coming in okay?
You are coming in loud and clear.
Okay, thanks. So I appreciate you organizing the call and everyone being on the call. I got the count when I logged on. It's over 100 people, so that's a great tribute to your outreach and the work that you do. So often when we talk about trade agreements, all of which have been bad for American workers, there's a tendency for people to want to know, well, the traditional thought is if white America catches a cold, then black America catches pneumonia. And this is one of those cases where I don't know that that's necessary to do a separate analysis to understand what happens to minority workers, because the trade agreements have overall done more damage to American wages and to American job prospects. And what I try to explain to people is if a policy is bad for workers, it just is not the case in the United States we've ever had a policy that was bad for workers, but somehow or another it was good for black workers. In the particular case of trade agreements, the problem is twofold. One, we don't have an adequate way of really compensating people who lose because of trade agreements. So even though we have trade adjustment assistance that tries to help workers, the data are clear that workers lose so much in terms of their earnings that we really can't compensate them for that. Simply training you and getting you another job never recovers the lost income. So there isn't a true compensation for losing your job. What we do know when there are mass job displacements, we know two things that are very particular to black workers among all workers. Blacks have the highest unemployment rate, and as a consequence, blacks do not tend to quit jobs and switch jobs, as is true for most other workers. So when you look at the data, black workers have the longest tenure with the firm. And that means you get a lot of firm-specific human capital, the kind of thing you get from being at the office and knowing where all the bones are buried and how to do the job at that place. And over time, the seniority and that knowledge get you a higher wage. When you lose that, there's no compensation for that. You don't ever get that back. So a large part of what happens when we have these big displacements is that blacks lose the most. Because of the higher unemployment rate faced by blacks, they are far less likely than any other set of workers to find new jobs, and the new jobs they find are always at much lower pay. So we don't have a politics that says that we really need to compensate the losers, and we know that disproportionately when black workers lose through these deals, they really lose. The evaluations that have been done of trade adjustment assistance document these kind of gaps. The trade adjustment itself, it costs money for the workers to remain out of the labor market and get training. And even when we train them for jobs you might well imagine would be more safe from economic downturns, they have a hard time making up for the wage losses. Most of the workers who agreed to do the take-up are older, and they simply lack enough time to have the new training pay off. So within the reasonable time frame that the programs are analyzed, which is sort of a 6 to 8 year window, the workers simply don't make back the lost income through going through training. Now, in the long run, they may become better off, but definitely not in the short run. It does help women a little bit more to go through TAA training, and that seems to be because we're able to train women to get into non-traditional positions. And so in many ways it transitions them with some help to new sets of opportunities. But even then they don't make up the loss from the training, from the time that they're not actually at work. So it would be very hard to imagine, given what we know about trade patterns with the Pacific, that there could be a way that black workers would gain. We know that Latino workers in particular would tend to lose because those regions that are most heavily impacted by the current level of China and Asian trade, San Jose, Los Angeles, and San Diego. That is where we have suffered the most in terms of job loss from manufacturing and the loss of job opportunities in those communities, broadly speaking. And those are heavy Latino communities, and it's part of the drag that's going on in California as a result of that. The two communities most affected with African American workers have been Chicago and Milwaukee. They're not as heavily affected by trade with China and the Pacific as is the case for the communities in California, but they are heavily impacted. They are among the 15 metropolitan areas where the impact from trade has been the worst. And we know what's happening in Milwaukee right now, which is a great drop in living standards for African Americans. And this recovery hasn't been able to reach them, in large part because of the damage done throughout this actual century to manufacturing in Milwaukee from trade with China and trade with Asia, generally speaking. So that lack of opportunity is continuing to plague the community in Milwaukee and continuing to drive big divisions in what's going on there. So I guess I would sum up, it just has never been the case that the U.S. has pursued a policy that was somehow or another bad for workers, but secretly or in some unknown way ended up being good for black workers or Latino workers. The regions we know that are most heavily impacted are communities that are heavily Latino, and we just don't have an adequate safety net to catch workers, and when workers are displaced, we know that black workers suffer the most. So I think those are the things to think about as TPP gets debated. There just aren't the kind of programs in place to ameliorate the losses, and frankly, no one has done a good job of showing where the gains are because, frankly, they don't exist.
Andrew, I think you may be muted. Okay, Andrew's probably going to need to unmute herself.
I was muted. Thanks, Adam.
Okay, now we can hear you.
All right, great. And Bill, you're going to be available for Q&A for it, right? For a few minutes at least?
Yes.
All right,
yes.
Because they're stacking up. All right, caller at area code 304. Go ahead. Your name and your city and then your question.
Hi, this is Mary Lickard calling from Charleston, West Virginia. And actually my question is for either speaker. I'm just wondering if you see these displacements as being quite purposeful, where you people are escaping and from Central America or wherever, moving north, or as we see in Syria, different situation, but anyway, I just
This is Guillermo Perez. I think that there's no question that to the degree that the trade agreements create this displacement leads to labor markets where, especially in the service sector now, these are jobs in the service sector that are now becoming more and more a part of our economy. They pay poorly, they don't have benefits, and then as we force workers to compete unfairly with exploited workers all over the world, then they're sort of forced domestically into this service sector. So, the pressure that's trying to be brought to bear on raising the minimum wage to $15, the fight for 15, is going to be only that much harder if there are more and more people displaced and having to turn to the low-paying service sector to try to find work. And in the case of Central America, I spoke to people in Honduras who told me and firmly believe that the government's policy was intended to drive people away because remittances now are such a huge part of their economy that, as I said, these unauthorized immigrants now become almost a kind of export, which is terrible for them and But I do believe it's all part of a neoliberal economics that wants disciplined labor markets and people desperate, working people desperate.
Thank you very much.
The pattern that we have seen of stagnant wages, declining labor share in national incomes, that's global. And so I think it's fair to characterize what's going on as a rewriting of the global pact. It gives far more rights to corporations. We still haven't had a successful clamping down on the way they move profits to avoid tax. And this tax avoidance that they're doing is part of what's in these agreements. And so we shouldn't be surprised. The agreements give far more power to the corporations than they do to the state. And so, yes, I think you can consider this, if not deliberate, to create situations and people have to immigrate from their home. You can consider it deliberate to make working conditions worse globally.
Thank you. Our next caller, I believe it looks like you are calling from Denver, area code, Colorado, area code 303.
Oh, hi. My name's April from Inglewood, and I was just curious about what kind of other economic theories or philosophies you see as being a viable that we need to work on implementing now. I know there's like behavior economics and ecological, and just wondering if you have any preferences. Thank you.
I don't know that I have I don't think that behavioral economics has a superiority to sort of standard economics. I mean, the insight behind behavioral is just that that economic actors may not act the way very simple economic theory would predict, but economists kind of already knew that. I think what we need to do is to change the way we get buffaloed into accepting what economists say when they pretend that their conditions aren't met. So economists will wave hands and pretend that labor markets are competitive, that capital markets are competitive, that there's free entry and free exit for capital within a country. Most of the models still don't have capital moving across borders. Most of their models still assume that there's going to be full employment, that wages will always clear the market. And that's just not true. That's just not being positive. That's not positive economics. It's making normative statements. What they're saying is they'd like, or they wish, or they hope, or they imagine that that's the way the economy is, and it isn't. So I think what we all have to do is just call them on their bluff when they're not being truthful, and require them to actually talk about how you would really compensate losers and force them into better agreements. But these are global agreements that give power to corporations, but don't give powers to states or to workers. And we have to give power to workers and to states to respond to capital. And none of these agreements put workers and states on equal footing with corporations. Corporations are given carte blanche, including the idea that they get their own settlement dispute. They get their own court. a court only for corporations. The problem with trying to enforce labor is that labor violations don't get don't get their own court. You have to go through the nation's court. We went one whole year in the United States without our National Labor Relations Board. We had 1 year in which if you wanted to complain about a labor violation under our right to bargain, you had no court. So this is absurd to suggest that these agreements make labor and capital equal. And, of course, we all know it's absurd to believe that labor is free to move and people can just move from San Jose to, because they lost their job because of a computer plant being shut down, and next they're going to show up in Texas. We know that doesn't happen. And we know unless you have policies in place to make it happen or allow it to happen, it's not going to happen. And so we just have to call these people for making statements that just aren't true under economic theory. They're not being honest.
All right. Next caller. I am seeing area code 760.
Hi, this is Tony O'Doherty, and it's a question for Bill Spriggs. I'm calling from California. Mr. Spriggs, I fully agree with the point you've made about the impact of existing agreements and the planned ones, that they are generally disadvantaged workers in general and workers of color in particular. I'm just wondering why we're not seeing this in the voting in the primaries. Is this a failure of communication on our part or the part of the unions, or is it just that the volume of stuff coming through from the promoters of these deals is too strong to waft it away? Thanks.
I'm not going to comment on either of the two candidates. If you mean why doesn't this reflect in people liking one candidate over the other, so I'm sorry, I'm going to dodge that one, and I'm just not in a position to judge either one of the candidates, and so I would not judge people's voting behavior based on that.
Bill, I'm going to reframe that question. Why are we not really seeing more of the TPP in the debates?
I think this is well. Let's be clear. I mean, so far, both in the case of the Democratic primary, both candidates have said they would not agree to the TPP. So I don't think we've seen it because they both say they would not agree with TPP. In the case of the Republican primary, of course, we have seen nothing but shouting and yelling and screaming and talking about male body parts. So I don't know that it's risen because in the case of the Democrats, they both have said they don't like TPP.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question, area code 905.
Hello.
We hear you. Go
yes.
ahead.
Oh, hi. I'm Fiona, and I'm calling from Ontario, Canada. I was interested in whether, for the TPP for Canada, our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper promised several $1 billion in compensation to our auto sector, and also somewhat less to our dairy sector, which is going to suffer under the TPP. And I wondered if there was anything equivalent on the U.S. side?
I am not aware of anything that would fairly compensate workers
All right, and I believe this is our last question. Paul, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Briggs, and thank you for being on this call. It's Paul Flansburgh from Rochester, New York, and I'm with the Sierra Club Atlantic chapter. I look at your resume, and it's really impressive. And given what you've been saying on this talk, I'm thinking to myself, wow, when you got appointed to be assistant secretary under the Obama administration, it's like, wow, finally things are going to happen. Things are going to get so much better. At least there's hope. And yet here we are in 2016, and Obama's pushing really hard for the TPP. So how do you reconcile those two things? You couldn't have been alone in your disparagement of these trade deals.
No, but the administration is quite schizophrenic. And yes, there's a Department of Labor, and yes, there's an International Trade Commission. And no, you would think that the Department of Labor, just by virtue of size and of the importance of what it represents, therefore should be more important than the International Trade Commission, or more important than the people in the White House who negotiated these deals, but that wasn't the case. I am at a total loss to explain why the administration wants to push TPP. I think it's bad economics, and I think it's bad politics. I don't have an answer for you for why at the end of an administration that has been totally frustrated on so many things, they would want to spend so much political capital. I'm at a loss. My own advice to them was they should take a dive, because they didn't get immigration reform, which we know we needed to make our labor market healthy, and just to do simple moral justice to the situation. It would be good economics and good moral behavior. And we never increased the minimum wage, and there are a host of other things that didn't get passed. So I said you should take a dive on this, and if for whatever unknown political reason people thought he was supposed to deliver on this, my advice was, well, rattle off all the things that you wanted that didn't happen. And just say, other things I wanted didn't happen too. So why be upset about this not happening? So I'm at a total loss why they want to fight for this.
And I really like your answer on that. So thank you very much, Bill. I'm going to do a last
Andrea, can you stack me?
151
go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, so this is more of a, if someone can mute yourself, there's a TV coming through or something. So this is more of a legal question than an economic question. But I'm looking right now at a report called Prison. This is from Huffington Post, called "Prison Quotas Push Lawmakers to Fill Beds, Derailed Reform," and it's talking about how a private prison company has a legal contract guaranteeing that 97% of their prison should remain full, and so that they're demanding compensation for the fact that the prisoner rate is not high enough. So that brings up for me a question as to whether firms invested in private prisons, as well as other companies engaged in the prison industrial complex that have various other forms of prison contracts, whether that's for phone service or toiletries or whatever else, could potentially, if they're foreign investors, bring suits under TPP and other investment treaties or trade agreements that include NAFTA-style investment chapters if prisons are not adequately filling them, or are not being adequately filled, and they're not being able to make enough money off of exploiting our unjust prison and criminal justice system.
Well, I think you have introduced how much of a blank check the court system that the corporations want would be. We would be handing over, not just in the prison case, which I wouldn't rule out that someone would make the arguments that you did. I would, in fact, anticipate that they probably would make the arguments that you're talking about, because we know that happened here in the U.S. I mean, the reason why we are detaining so many people for immigration violation is because they are sent to private prisons. And we've signed contracts to fill those private prisons, and that's why we're detaining so many people for what is a civil offense. And so given the complaints of U.S. corporations that run those facilities to make sure that they get their money's worth, I would have to imagine that a foreign company would do the same thing. Though, you know, we've never settled the issue of what is citizenship for a corporation. Quite clear in the Constitution, we envision what that meant for human beings. But we've never settled what does citizenship mean for a corporation. What country are they? What citizenship are they? And so, I mean, I don't even know that for the moment that the corporations that run the prisons are actually American in the sense that one might use the term American.
Thank you.
Adam, thank you for that question, because that is a very, very, very tremendous interest to me as well. And there are some states, Virginia, Florida, and a couple of others, Arizona, their contract with the for-profit prisons guarantee 100% occupancy. So just be aware that there are a number of states where they guarantee their prisons that every bed will be filled. So they have a tremendous incentive to lock people up, and there is no incentive to rehabilitate people and ultimately return them back into society. Dr. Margaret Flowers, are you here? Margaret may not be able to join us tonight. Well, Bill and Guillermo, I am going to thank both of you again. It was wonderful having you join us this evening. Adam, I'm going to bring you up next. You heard the question from Mr. Adam Watson. He's a member of our call planning team. As a matter of fact, Adam recruits a number of our speakers. Adam is with Global Justice for Animals and the Environment and with Trade Justice Metro New York. Adam is going to go over some of the trade news stories from this week. So, Adam, take it away.
Thank you. So first of all, I have to begin with a bit of an apology. Most of you know that on these calls I usually premiere the week's newsletter, where in addition to the stories that you read about on screen, there are usually about 30 or 40 or 50 more news stories. That newsletter is going to be delayed this week because my computer felt it would be a really great idea to erase 4 days of work this week. So back to the drawing board. I will be getting it out in another day or two, and I will, if people want to make sure that I email that to you, put your email in the chat box or just send me an email at adam@tradejustice.net so I can make sure you get the full newsletter with the list of upcoming events and all the other news stories. But so I do have a few news stories for you tonight, so I'll get on to presenting those. So a lot of news this week in relation to the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. We heard last week about the beginning of the latest round of TTIP talks, and so a lot is happening in that arena. One thing is that we've heard on recent calls about the sort of ISDS light that the European Union is proposing for TTIP. This would be an investor court in the place of the investor arbitrations under TPP and other trade agreements. Well, the U.S. has yet to accept Europe's proposal on this, which will have interesting political implications down the line, because this was supposed to be the middle ground position that was going to address the deep concerns of many European legislators and many in the European public about ISDS. So if the U.S. ultimately doesn't accept it, it brings into real question where things go from there. As for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Economic Policy Institute has released a new report talking about the U.S. trade deficit with countries in TPP in 2015, saying that we had a 2 million, looking at the specific trade deficit in 2015, saying that the U.S. trade deficit cost 2 million jobs last year with TPP countries, and that currency manipulation, which is not addressed in TPP, is a big part of the problem, and will continue to be a part of the problem since it wasn't addressed in this agreement. So that's a report from the Economic Policy Institute. Moving on to another economist, Joseph Stiglitz, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and who has been a very vocal critic of TPP. He was featured in a new video out this week from Credo with Lori Wallach criticizing and really fact-checking some of the positions and statements the President has made on TPP. With regards to TTIP, he has now said that the UK would be better off leaving the European Union than going into the European Union and by extension joining TTIP. So it's very harsh criticism of TTIP's potential damage. In troubling news, we have seen that coming out of Super Tuesday, it is now looking clearer than ever that the two candidates going into this general election will most likely be critics of TPP. And on there are real questions. People have posted some in the chat box. Whether if Hillary Clinton wins on the Democratic side, she will stick to that position, but her position as it stands is a critical position on TPP, and Donald Trump has been very vocally opposed to TPP since really even before his candidacy. He's a pretty long-standing opponent of these kind of trade deals. So that's one position that people think he will probably stick to. So there, with that politics as backdrop, there is a real push now to try to move ahead on closing some of the other trade negotiations that are currently underway, with the goal of ending the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations if there's agreement on the substance by the end of 2016, and also potentially ending negotiations for the Trade and Services Agreement. This is all very troubling because we had expected that these negotiations would continue on for quite some time, but the fear that we may be going into a new administration that does not support these kind of trade deals is pushing for a quick wrap-up so that they can sort of have a blockbuster vote before a new administration is seated that will not support these deals. This is also rushing towards conclusion now is RCEP, which is the trade agreement that is seen as the competitor to TPP. This is a trade agreement that includes many of the ASEAN nations as well as nations that they are in trade agreements with, and unlike TPP includes China but does not include the U.S. That's also on track for a goal of a 2016 negotiating conclusion. A bunch of WTO news in the last week, quite a few different WTO-related stories, from a new push for Iran to be added to the WTO, to a bunch of cases filed. One of note, Namibia is going to the WTO to challenge new sanitary and phytosanitary measures by South Africa on imported livestock that Namibia is saying would be very destructive to their domestic livestock industry. But of course, we should have ongoing concerns about attempts to attack attack sanitary measures that are, and food safety rules through trade agreements and through the WTO. And the reason why that should concern us, one example, is COOL, country of origin labeling for meat, which the last blow to COOL, which just happened within the last week, as new rules were put in place to finally, in compliance with Congress's vote, in compliance with the WTO ruling, eliminate the last of mandatory country of origin labeling on U.S. meat products. So consumers will no longer know the origin in which the meat products they buy are produced, undermining any effort to really use the the incentive to consumers of wanting to support countries that have higher environmental, labor, or food safety standards to incentivize corporations producing in countries with higher standards. If consumers have no way to know where those products are produced, they have an interest in going to the most deregulated markets. And final news story, the Obama we heard this evening from someone who has been connected to this administration being critical of this deal. Two more examples. Former senior advisors to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy have written an article this week calling on the Obama administration to finally adopt a pro-transparency trade policy after years of secret TPP, TTIP, and TISA negotiations, saying that this administration that has prided itself really on its commitment to transparency needs to reverse course on these secret trade negotiations and hold open trade negotiations so that the benefit of public input can actually influence these deals and ultimately make better deals. That these deals should not only be influenced by the corporate advisors, the 500 out of 600 advisors, roughly 500 out of 600 advisors on advisory committees who are corporate representatives and have an inside track to the negotiations, but that we, the people, that civil society groups and media and elected officials at all levels should be able to see and influence these trade negotiations as they happen. Next slide. Thank you, Andrew. So these calls are a great deal of work to organize, and a critical piece of them in making them successful is ensuring that we keep getting the word out about these calls. We need your help to do that. We need your help in booking speakers. We need your help in coming up with ideas for calls. We need your help in putting together these PowerPoint presentations that Harriet and Andrea every week put a great deal of time into compiling. We need your help also in getting the word out, in asking organizations to endorse and promote these calls, in promoting them over social media, in inviting legislative staff to be a part of the audience for these calls, in getting the word out to our local elected officials and to our faith leaders that these calls are an opportunity for them to learn about these trade agreements that can have such a profound impact on all of our lives. These are volunteer-run efforts, and we would love for every person on this call to take a part in being part of this planning and promotion. You can do that by joining one or both of two committees. We have a call planning team and a call outreach and promotion team. If you would like to join those committees, you can email me at adam@tradejustice.net, and I would be happy to tell you when our next online phone conferences to be part of this planning process. You can also, when you do that, let me know the days and times that work best for you. As with both committees, we're now working on setting up a regular meeting schedule, and we'd be happy to take your schedule into consideration if you would like to join in our planning efforts. Next slide. Thanks. So one announcement, our next weekly call is not until now bi-weekly calls. In March, we're going to be moving to a bi-weekly call schedule. However, that doesn't mean that you need to wait until 2 weeks from now to get your fix of TPP conference calls. Our friends at Flush the TPP are also moving to a bi-weekly schedule, so their next call is on March 16th. And that day there will actually be 2 TPP calls that you can participate in. The first of those calls is going to be on Wednesday, March 6th at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific, and that's a Citizens Trade Campaign briefing on the TPP and climate change with Ilana Solomon, who is the director of the Sierra Club Responsible Trade Program. I just watched Ilana the other day testify before a congressional hearing about the TPP that was held by House Democrats in the Ways and Means Committee, and she did a great job of outlining why these trade agreements are so destructive to the environment. And I'll post that link in the chat box if you'd like to watch her testimony. But many of you will also remember that she was just recently on our call with Bill McKibben. The Sierra Club and other groups have released a new report looking at how the oil industry and other polluters have benefited and will continue to benefit from the kind of investor rights that we've heard about on this call, and how that threatens our ability to protect the environment. Then later that night at 9 p.m., you can join our friends at Flush the TPP for their call. This is a call that is really focused on action, on looking at some of the concrete action steps that we can all take to help fight these unfair trade deals. If you'd like to sign up for those calls, you can go to flushthetpp.org, and when you get there, click on the news link. At the very top there, it'll say National TPP Resistance Calls. You click that link, and right below there is a lot of links. There's another link that says, click here to register for the calls. I'll post that link in the chat box if people want to just go right there. But once you register for those calls, you never have to register again. You're registered to get announcements about each call. And so this is a great place to network with other activists, find out about some of the concrete activist campaigns people are going to be working on to fight the TPP. And then I guess moving on, after that we'll be having our next call just a few days later. And just as the call on the 16th at Citizens Trade Campaign is going to be focusing on some of the fossil fuel industries and their role in driving climate change and how that will be exacerbated by TPP. Andrea, we can move on to the next slide. On 4 days later, will be looking at another aspect of how free trade agreements contribute to climate change, an area that is not addressed as much. Some of you may remember late last year we had a call with Ben Lilliston of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. This is our call that was the sort of report back from the Paris climate talks. And one of the things that Ben focused on that call was how agriculture, and particularly animal agriculture, threaten our global climate and environment, and how we need to promote sustainable models of agriculture, not corporate agribusiness and not expanded animal agriculture, but TPP pushes in the wrong direction. We're going to be going into greater depth on that issue. We'll also be having a representative from an international organization called GRAIN, and we're going to look at how some of the unsustainable models of agriculture being pushed by TPP, things like industrial farming, things like expanding animal agriculture and animal consumption into parts of the world that have predominantly plant-based diets, things like the palm oil trade, are contributing and will contribute under TPP in an even greater degree to deforestation, to water pollution, and to climate change. This call is being organized in conjunction with an annual event called Meet Out on March 20th, as well as International Day for Forests, which is a UN event on March 20th, on March 21st, and also another UN Day, International Day, which is World Water Day on March 22nd. So this is a really clear illustration about how all of these issues are interconnected and how these trade agreements are going to take a bad situation and make it even worse. Then moving ahead, on April 3rd, we're going to be rejoined by our old friend Liz Warren. Old-timers on the call know that Liz was really the founder of these calls. This is not Senator Elizabeth Warren, but Liz Warren, who formerly of Move On, who more recently with People Demanding Action, who really initiated these calls, and she is going to be rejoining us for a very special call that she'll be moderating and is organizing, looking at women's issues and the TPP. We're working on booking some very special guests for that call, or Liz is working on booking some very special guests for that call. Then on April 17th, we're going to be having a special Earth Day call, and at this point, tentatively, that call will be focusing on water privatization, but we may be switching to focus that call on the issue of logging and forest destruction and how that relates to TPP. If that's not on the 17th, that is a call we'll be looking at very soon, looking at the failure of the forestry annex of the Peru Free Trade Agreement, how the broken promises of these so-called pro-environment trade deals illustrate how TPP will take a bad situation and make them even worse, particularly when we're looking at a trade agreement that includes countries with some of the world's most severely endangered forests and most critical biodiverse ecosystems in desperate need of protection. Finally, on May 1st, we'll be having a call in celebration of May Day, looking at international labor rights. We've talked a great deal on these calls about some of the impacts that TPP will have on labor here in the United States. We've also looked at the issue of forced labor overseas. We're going to be on this call looking at the global labor movement and how unionization efforts and labor rights may be undermined by these trade agreements, and particularly about how TPP will fail to address some of the labor rights violations in countries like like Mexico, Vietnam, and Malaysia that currently have very severe violations of labor rights, low wages, unfair working conditions, an anti-union climate, if not outright ban on labor unions. And so on this call, we'll be focused on global labor solidarity for May Day. So that's some of our upcoming calls. Again, please, if you'd like to join us for these calls, you can. If you didn't register for this call, someone passed you on the information, you can go to tradejustice.net/callreg to register. If you started on this webinar late, or if you'd like to share the webinar with others, or if you'd like to watch it again because you'd like to go over some of this information 5 more times so it all sinks in, you can go to tradejustice.net/webinar-vids, that's WEBINAR-VIDS, in just a few hours, and our friend Anti-TPP will be uploading the video of this webinar, and you can see many of the past webinars there as well. And please do share them. Send an email to your member of Congress and say that I just watched this webinar about the TPP, and I think you and your staff need to watch it as well to understand why this agreement needs to be stopped, why this agreement is so destructive to so many, and you can send them the webinars for every week until they get the message. So thank you, everyone. That's the end of my report, and let's keep fighting the TPP and other unfair trade deals.
All right. Thank you, Adam. I think I've got one question. Mark, go ahead. Your line's open.
Hello. I just looked this up on the Internet. Did you know that Tom Donahoe, Chamber of Commerce president, said he expected Hillary Clinton would ultimately support the TPP if she becomes the Democratic nominee for president?
I did. I've actually seen that interview, well, just speaking personal opinion, I think that is not an unlikely hypothesis. We were given Hillary Clinton's support for TPP as Secretary of State. I think I wouldn't be shocked by that. I think, though, that for us, that means that we need to keep letting Hillary know that this is a voting issue for us, both in the general election and in the primary. That our support for any candidate is contingent on their position on this issue. If you're a Hillary supporter, let her know that your support and your continued support is contingent on her ongoing commitment to opposing TPP. If you're a Bernie supporter, you can say that you are not convinced that she is strong enough on TPP, and that for you to reconsider your primary position, and you need to hear that her speak out more strongly on this issue. And if she wins the primary ultimately and is a general election candidate, you need to hear that she's going to not flip-flop. Let her speak directly to that challenge and say that it's not true and that she's going to stand against TPP. We have reason to fear her sincerity on this issue because, as a candidate, she was opposed to agreements like the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, which she supported as part of the Obama administration. Because, as a candidate, she was opposed to NAFTA, and of course TPP is NAFTA on steroids. So these are reasonable concerns. You can even let her know that in a general election she may be facing a candidate who, despite other reservations many of us may have about him, is a staunch foe of TPP, and that she should be at least as strongly opposed as that other guy.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everybody. I am turning off